welcome to everyone in the online audience. My name is Michael Katatis. I am going to be your chair this evening. I'm replacing David Shankland, who usually chairs these events, and I'm delighted to welcome you all to this fascinating lecture to be delivered by Dr. Vladimir Hamed-Troyansky, who is a historian of global migration and forced displacement, as well as assistant professor of global studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Vladimir is going to be talking about his first book, which was published by Stanford University Press this February, entitled The Empire of Refugees, North Caucasian Muslims and the Late Ottoman State. And it's a fascinating account of the settlers who came from the Caucasus regions, escaping the Russian advance and being resettled in different parts of the Ottoman Empire in the 14 modern states that made up the Ottoman Empire. Places like Turkey, of course, Jordan, Syria, Israel, Iraq, Bulgaria, and Greece. It's a major contribution to the history of the late Ottoman Empire and to refugee studies, and several different strands we can pick out from the work. So what we're going to do is we're going to soon pass over to Vladimir to present the book through a lecture. That will last about 45 minutes. I will then chair a question and answer session, ask a few questions myself, and then open up to the floor for other questions. So I'm going to now pass over to Vladimir without further ado. We're delighted to have you, Vladimir. Welcome to the Anglo-Turkish Society. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. It is a pleasure and an honor to be giving this talk, and many thanks to Craig Anger for inviting me, and to Michael Katakis for sharing and for this very generous introduction. And thank you to the Anglo-Turkish Society for virtually hosting me. Now I'm going to share my slides. Okay, so today I will present my first book, Empire of Refugees, North Caucasian Muslims and the Late Ottoman State. It was published by Stanford University Press earlier this year in February. And this book has been 10 years in the making, so I'm thrilled to be sharing it with the world. Empire of Refugees is a transnational history of migration. It looks at the displacement and resettlement of about 1 million refugees from Russia in the Ottoman Empire. And it examines how these Muslim refugees transformed the late Ottoman Middle East and the late Ottoman Balkans, and how the two empires, the Ottomans and the Russians, managed Muslim mobility. And I will start today with the story of one family. In 1890, two half-brothers, Fuat and Jivat Hutat, eagerly expected the arrival of their mother, Hanifa Hanım, from Russia. 10 years earlier, the two men had left their native Circassia in the Northwest Caucasus, and now they lived in Istanbul. The eldest brother, Fuat, was about to graduate from the Ottoman Military Academy. The youngest brother, Jivat, was a lawyer looking for a job. They both were Circassian refugees from Russia who had survived the ethnic cleansing of their kin by the Russian military in the 1860s. Their mother, and thankfully we have her photograph as well, Hanifa Hanım, she safely arrived and she registered with the Ottoman Refugee Commission, which was a state agency tasked with resettling Muslim refugees throughout the Ottoman Empire. The brothers petitioned the Refugee Commission, asking to move their mother to Istanbul to be with them. But the government refused and settled her and the rest of the family in a refugee camp near Adana in southern Anatolia. Jivat moved there to be with his relatives, and Fuat stayed in Istanbul to finish his studies. This Circassian refugee family was now displaced and scattered across the empire, and they started a long quest in their search for a perfect resettlement place in their new country. And I know this story because a descendant of Jivat, 130 years later, kindly shared with me 58 private letters in Ottoman Turkish that Fuat wrote to his brother in the 19th century. And the family kept those letters all these years, These latter spent their correspondence in the Caucasus, in Istanbul, Anatolia, and Greater Syria, Bilad Sham. So today we will follow this refugee family on their journey, and it will frame the discussion of this book and the history of Muslim refugee migration in the Ottoman Empire. Empire of Refugees has 7 chapters. The first two provide a bird's eye view on trans-imperial mobility. Chapter 1 looks at what was happening on the Russian side of the border and why so many Muslims became refugees, why they were expelled from Russia. Chapter 2 focuses on what was happening on the Ottoman side of the border, why the Ottoman government was so welcoming to Muslim refugees, and how it constructed immigration and Muslim refugee policies. The next 3 chapters are regional. They are micro-histories of refugee resettlement in the empire, and they look at different parts of the empire. So we're looking at the Balkans, at the Levant and Anatolia, the 3 historic parts of the Ottoman Empire, and at regions with very different environmental conditions. So in the Balkans, it's Dobruja, a steppe region on the Black Sea, split now between Bulgaria and Romania. In the Levant, it's the arid semi-desert region of central Jordan. And in Anatolia is the region of Uzun, which is right in the middle of Anatolia, is the high mountains. And the final chapters of the book are thematic. I'm looking at the strategies that North Caucasian refugees took to survive in their new homeland. Chapter 6 reconstructs step by step the evolution of the North Caucasian diaspora from its political advocacy in Istanbul to devising scripts for different North Caucasian languages to communicating with their families in the Caucasus. And then the final chapter takes the book full circle and looks at those refugees who decided not to stay in the Middle East and who tried to return to the Caucasus under Tsarist rule. So now let's turn to the historical context for this story. By the mid-19th century, the North Caucasus, a mountainous region between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, had a majority Sunni Muslim population. And most people who ended up being refugees to the Ottoman Empire belonged to the following ethnic groups. Western Circassians, who were living on the coast of the Black Sea, Abkhazians living between the Circassians and the Georgians on the Black Sea coast, then Eastern Circassians, Karachais, Balkars, Ossetians, Ingush, and Chechens living in the uplands and mountain valleys, kind of in the middle of the Caucasus Mountains, and then over 30 different ethnic groups, collectively known as Dagestanis, living on the Caspian Sea coast. Most of the communities in the North Caucasus speak languages that are unrelated to Indo-European, Turkic, or Semitic language families. Most of the languages here belong to the Northwest Caucasian and Northeast Caucasian language families that are unique to the region. And most of the languages are also mutually unintelligible with each other. But in the 19th century, the dominant literary language in the region was Arabic, despite not being native to anyone in the Caucasus. Before the 19th century, communities in the North Caucasus were autonomous, and they were not really part of the larger surrounding empires, either the Russian Empire or the Ottoman Empire or Iran. The Russian government completed the conquest of the region by 1864, after waging the so-called Caucasus War against indigenous Muslim populations. And in the final years of the war, in 1863 and 1864, the Russian military carried out an ethnic cleansing of Western Circassians. So several dozen Circassian villages were burnt, people fled, survivors fled in panic to the Circassian coast. And then from the Circassian coast, people fled as refugees by boats to the Ottoman Empire. So in the span of 2 years, over 500,000, over 500,000 people, up to 90% of the entire community were displaced as refugees. Since the 1990s, many Circassian activists in the North Caucasus, within the Russian Federation, and also in the diaspora, in the Middle East, in the United States, and elsewhere, called for the recognition of those atrocities in the 1860s as a genocide. The impact of this displacement was massive. It was the largest ethnic cleansing in Russian imperial history, and it really allowed Russia to solidify its rule over the Caucasus. So if you think about the territorial evolution of the Russian Empire, most regions that Russia conquered in the 18th and 19th centuries since then became independent. So it's Poland, Finland, Ukraine, the Baltic states, the South Caucasus states, and the Central Asian states. But one region that is not independent, that was annexed in that period, is the North Caucasus. And this story is key to that because of this massive displacement of indigenous Muslim communities and settler colonialism, the colonization of the region by Russian and Ukrainian settlers, and also other Slavic and Christian settlers that started in the mid-19th century. Now, the arrival of Circassian refugees was also hugely important in Ottoman history. It was the largest refugee crisis in Ottoman history at that point, and one of the largest globally at the time. After the Caucasus War, so after 1864, Muslim emigration from the Caucasus under Russian rule continued, and people were moving to the Ottoman Empire for different reasons. And emigration extended to virtually every ethnic and social group in the region. So one of the big reasons for that emigration was dispossession. The Russian government passed land reforms in the Caucasus in the 1860s that dispossessed many Muslim communities. Many Muslim villages were forcibly displaced. They were moved from the uplands to the lowlands, usually to be surrounded by Cossack settlements as a way of Tsarist control over those communities. So that internal displacement then bred emigration to the Ottoman Empire. Another reason for displacement was slavery. The abolition of slavery in the Caucasus pushed out many wealthy North Caucasians who then transplanted slavery from the Caucasus to the Ottoman countryside. And slavery plays a huge role in the story and also in the book. This refugee crisis from the Caucasus reinforced the institution of Ottoman slavery. When Circassian refugees arrived in Ottoman ports, there was a massive humanitarian crisis. People were dying in the ports. There was not enough food. Epidemic diseases were breaking out. And also, slave merchants moved into the Ottoman ports to purchase people in their dire time of need. And many families had no choice but to sell their loved ones and sometimes to sell people who were already in some kind of bondage to them, to those slave merchants. So what happened next is that the supply of enslaved Circassians bloated the Ottoman slave market and prices fell. So many people who could not afford owning enslaved individuals before now could. Circassian slavery, which was an old but dying institution at the time, got a new breath of life, and many more elites in the empire became invested in preserving the institution of slavery. So this refugee migration is a big reason why slavery as an institution survived until the very end of the Ottoman Empire, because it was reinvigorated in the mid-19th century. Many families left the Caucasus, like the Khutats did, because they were pushed out by new Russian laws that privileged settlers at the expense of Muslim populations. And then many Muslim families left because they perceived emigration to be their religious obligation. Overall, about 1 million people fled the North Caucasus to the Ottoman Empire's refugees. The death toll during this displacement was massive. So many people died while waiting for resettlement in the Ottoman ports, or waiting for the boats on the Circassian coast, or being in the boats when crossing the Black Sea. So in total, less than 1 million people actually survived, lived to be resettled in the Ottoman Empire. Now back to the Khutats. In the early 1890s, the Khutats found themselves dispersed in the massive empire. Fuat was in Istanbul. His mother, sister, and brother were in a refugee camp near Adana, and then they also had relatives in the Caucasus and in a refugee camp near Konya. The marshes near Adana were a breeding ground for mosquitoes, and thousands of refugees had died in those settlements. The Khutats petitioned the government, begging the state to move their family somewhere else, somewhere safe. Their dream was to find an empty place where they could establish a Circassian village and invite all their kin and friends to live together again. And that was a dream for many refugees. In 1892, the family managed to escape the deadly marshes of Chukurova up north to a mountain valley of Uzun Yayla, which is this fantastic, fascinating place. Uzun Yayla in Turkish means the long plateau. And in this mountain valley, in the 1860s, about 40,000 North Caucasian refugees set up over 70 refugee villages. And these were also refugees from different ethnic groups in the North Caucasus. So to this day, in the Circassian diaspora, this valley of Uzun Yayla is known as Küçük Kafkasya, which translates from Turkish as the Little Caucasus, because the Caucasus was in a way reconstructed culturally in the middle of Anatolia in that valley. And there's a chapter in the book about this mountain valley. The Hutas were excited to be there. In the meantime, Fuat finished his studies and he entered the Ottoman military. He was sent to the headquarters of the 4th Ottoman Army in Erzincan, close to the Russian border. He was probably sent there because of his familiarity with the Caucasus, which could be useful to the Ottoman military. He would visit his family in their new home in Uzun Yayla, and he would also write many letters. And in his letters to his brother Jivat, he sent detailed homeschooling curricula for the children. He was very invested in making sure that the new generations of the Hutas received good education. So he instructed the children to be good Ottoman children and study Ottoman Turkish, because Ottoman Turkish was absolutely the future. But also they had to stay Circassian and follow Circassian customs. For example, Hutat boys were expected to practice horse riding every day. His brother, Jivat, stayed with the family. He put aside his dreams of being a lawyer, and he was trying to hold the family together. Now, let's have a look at what Ottoman refugee resettlement looked like. Let's look at the big picture. The Ottoman government resettled North Caucasian refugees in virtually every Ottoman province. North Caucasians settled in what today are 14 different nation states. So in the 1860s, about half of all refugees went to the Balkans, the Ottoman Balkans. But then during the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-78, Circassian refugees fled with the retreating Ottoman army to Anatolia and Syria, and they were not allowed to go back to the Balkans. So by the end of the empire, that's what the geography of resettlement looked like. There were over 1,100 refugee villages scattered all the way from eastern Thrace to Kurdistan and southern parts of Bilad al-Sham. I'm now going to switch from this map to a screenshot of my digital database. So this map is based on my research and also on the painstaking work of North Caucasian activists in Turkey, Syria, and Jordan who made their data publicly available. So there were 1,100 refugee villages, and most of them were new. They were established in the last 50 years before the end of Ottoman rule. The map is color-coded for different ethnic groups. So this map only shows refugee villages established by North Caucasians. You can imagine other layers to this story of Muslim refugee resettlement. There were hundreds of refugee villages established by Bosnians, Albanians, Bulgarian Muslims, Muslims from Crete, from Cyprus, from Crimea. That's what the Ottoman Empire looked like at the end. There were refugee villages throughout different Ottoman environments. Today, the North Caucasian diaspora counts up to 3 million people in Turkey. It's the largest ethnic community, minority community after the Kurds and now the Syrians. There are also up to 100,000 descendants of North Caucasian, up to 100,000 North Caucasians in Syria, up to 50,000 in Jordan, and there are smaller communities in Iraq, Israel, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt. At this point, very few North Caucasians in the Middle East would speak their ancestral languages, be it Circassian or Chechen or Ossetian. Most people would speak Turkish or Arabic as their native language, depending on when they were settled in the late Ottoman era. Nevertheless, there are young people, say in their 20s, especially in rural, isolated communities like Uzunyaila that I mentioned, who would still grow up speaking Circassian because those communities are so compact and tight-knit. So in some ways, the preservation of cultural heritage is remarkable, considering that this displacement took place in the 19th century. The central argument in this book is that between 1860 and World War I, the Ottoman government established a refugee regime for incoming Muslims. What is a refugee regime? A refugee regime is a set of principles, norms, and procedures governing the acceptance and resettlement of refugees. And when we talk about refugee regimes, we usually think about the 20th century. We think about World War II and the aftermath of World War II, the establishment of the United Nations, and the formation of the contemporary international refugee regime managed by UNHCR, the United Nations Refugee Agency. And that regime is anchored by the 1951 Refugee Convention. Some historians in our field, in the field of Middle Eastern studies, made an argument that already in the interwar period, there were some elements of refugee protections that we could describe as the first international refugee regime managed by the League of Nations. This book shows, it's a historiographical correction, that already in the second half of the 19th century, a Muslim country, the Ottoman Empire, was offering a package of protections that was remarkably similar to refugee protections that we would expect today. So what did this refugee regime consist of? The legislative basis for this refugee regime rested on two laws: the Immigration Law of 1857 and the Land Code of 1858. So the Immigration Law of 1857 allowed immigration in the Ottoman Empire to everyone, irrespective of their religion. It was very liberal legislation. The Ottomans initially wanted European farmers to immigrate and to bring their capital to establish farms or homesteads and to become productive farmers and taxpayers to the Ottoman state. So in this sense, the Ottoman Empire was actually hoping to compete with the United States, with South Africa, with Australia, and other settler colonial societies for European farmers. The immigration law guaranteed free land and temporary benefits, such as exemptions from military service and taxation from 6 to 12 years. The Land Code, which I think was the single most important Ottoman law in the 19th century, standardized Ottoman land tenure and land ownership. And the government wanted to make Ottoman land practices legible to foreign investors. The government also wanted to centralize its control over agricultural land in the empire. And to this day, national land laws in countries like Turkey and Syria and Israel, and to a lesser extent, Greece and Bulgaria, they stem or they borrow in many ways from this Ottoman Land Code of 1858. So to handle the arrival of hundreds of thousands of refugees from Russia, the Ottoman government founded the and I should also mention that this land legislation was favorable to immigrants. It allowed the government to confiscate land from local populations who did not pay tax on that land. And then they could, give that land to reassign it to immigrants. So to handle the arrival of hundreds of thousands of refugees from Russia, the Ottomans established the Ottoman Refugee Commission in 1860. And this organization would then take the existing legislation for immigrants and build on it to construct a refugee regime. Because refugees escaping Russia had very different needs than the immigrants that the Ottoman government envisaged, hoped for. People arrived with nothing. There was no money to speak of. Usually, most people arrived on boats fleeing ethnic cleansing or genocide, and they needed immediate help from the Ottoman government to survive. So on top of the free land and the exemptions from taxation, the government was providing subsidies. It was providing financial aid and food, grain, to help refugees survive for the first couple of years. Over the next half century, the Ottoman Refugee Commission evolved into one of the world's largest refugee resettlement agencies. It settled anywhere between 3 and 5 million Muslim refugees by the time of World War I. primarily refugees from Russia and the Balkans. Okay, that's the legislative basis. The ideological basis for this refugee regime was the Ottoman Empire's and the Ottoman Sultan's responsibility to protect Muslims wherever they lived. At the core of this refugee regime was the idea of hijrah. Hijrah is the journey of the Prophet Muhammad from Mecca to Medina in the 7th century to protect the earliest Muslim community. And later in Islamic history, hijrah was interpreted as migration of Muslims from a non-Muslim territory or a Muslim territory that was occupied by non-Muslims to a safe Muslim territory. And it was widely interpreted as a religious obligation, a journey one must take to save their faith. So by the 19th century, hijrah became an anti-colonial movement of sorts because so many Muslims were fleeing European conquests and occupations, and they were mostly fleeing to the Ottoman Empire because the Ottoman Empire was the caliphate and it was the strongest surviving Muslim state, and the Ottomans were welcoming to Muslim refugees. So Muslim refugees from the Caucasus and also from Crimea and the Balkans almost exclusively used the term muhajir, which comes from hijrah. And muhajir can be translated from Arabic and from Ottoman Turkish into English as refugee, immigrant, and emigrant. In the 19th century, it had this very strong religious connotations. And the Ottoman government was also almost exclusively using the term muhajir to describe these Muslim refugees arriving in the empire. The Ottoman refugee regime guaranteed acceptance and resettlement for any displaced Muslim. Meanwhile, the Ottomans still had their immigration system because they still had that immigration law of 1857, which guaranteed admission, well, not guaranteed, which allowed the possibility of admission to everyone, irrespective of their religion. So through the immigration system, non-Muslims, meaning foreign Jews and foreign Christians, could enter the empire. And some did. So that's the story of Jewish migration to Ottoman Palestine in the 1880s onwards. However, non-Muslim migrants were not resettled by the Refugee Commission, they were not granted refugee subsidies, and their admission was not guaranteed. It had to be negotiated directly with the central government. Okay, this refugee regime was serving the Ottoman state. The Ottomans were using Muslim refugees for all kinds of purposes, depending on where they settled them. And we can think of this use of Muslim refugees by the Ottomans like in three big frameworks. So there were three big objectives of refugee resettlement. The first one was to increase the rural farming population of the empire. Muslim refugees were not allowed to move into the cities. They were supposed to stay on the land. Otherwise, free land would be taken away from them. And they would lose the cities and the exemptions. So they were supposed, no matter where they came from, they were supposed to become farmers. The second objective, the Ottoman government wanted to bring nomadic territories in Anatolia and the Levant closer under the control of Istanbul. So the government was extending Ottoman sovereignty to territories it claimed it controlled, but that it didn't really control. And then the final objective, especially after 1878, after the loss in the Russo-Ottoman War and the Treaty of Berlin, the Ottoman government was using Muslim refugees to alter demographic ratios in the empire. Specifically, it wanted to increase Muslim population in Greek and Armenian areas. And this is a very important point. Ethnic cleansing and humanitarianism often come together. We imagine them as complete opposites, but they complement each other by design. In the Ottoman case, the resettlement of Muslim refugees went hand in hand with the displacement of Ottoman Christians, especially after 1878, especially by the 1900s and 1910s. By the time of World War I, the Ottoman government intended for Muslim refugees to take homes and lands of Christians, many of whom were deported and murdered in the Armenian genocide. Now let's zoom back into the 1890s. The Hutats were growing concerned about their settlement in the middle of Anatolia, in the mountains. They were worried about the deterioration of security in their mountain village, in their mountain valley. The economy of the valley was failing. It was too cold, too mountainous, and too isolated from any roads. So people couldn't really export anything. The economy was stagnating. So the Hutats started looking for another place. Fuad wrote letters to his friends, other refugees, and he was discussing where they could settle, where they would have favorable environment for their new village. In his letters to Jivat, he discussed different options. The Hutas could move to Konya in central Anatolia. They could move near Trabzon in the northeast, to Malatya in eastern Anatolia, or even try to buy land near Istanbul. The Hutats' search for a perfect location ended with an unexpected invitation. Jivat, the younger brother, received a letter from a family they used to know in the Caucasus. This family now lived as far away as possible. They lived hours of riding to the east of Jerusalem. They lived in a Circassian refugee village that was named Amman. Fuad was not keen on the idea of his family relocating to the edge of the Syrian desert. But Jivat insisted on giving Amman a chance. He went to check it out in 1896, and he liked it so much that he telegraphed his brother for an immediate money order. Fuad sent the money, and Jivat immediately invested that money into buying land in Amman. So now the family was tied to that investment. They had to move. They moved from Uzunyaila by land to Adana, then by boat to Beirut, and then by land to Amman via Damascus. Jivat finally found a career. He became a farmer, but also a real estate entrepreneur. His business strategy was simple. He would grow wheat, he would sell grain to Jordanian merchants, and he would reinvest capital into more real estate, and he would grow more wheat, and then he would repeat the cycle. His brother, Fuad, he remained in Erzincan to keep his military career. He petitioned the government several times asking to relocate him to military headquarters in Damascus, but he was refused. He became a supporter of his family's relocation to the edge of the Syrian desert because his superiors told him that one day the Ottomans might build a railway there, and the area will no longer be so isolated. He wrote many letters to his brother, saying, and I quote, "However much you can save, put it back into the soil immediately. That is, turn it into real estate. There is nothing more valuable than land to get by in this world." End quote. And the Hutas were not alone in their excitement about Jordan. Jordan was the southernmost area of refugee resettlement in the empire. And the first Circassians arrived there in 1878. By World War I, Circassian and Chechen refugees established 8 villages. Circassians were building Amman on the Roman ruins of an ancient city. And the first Circassian refugees, they settled in the ruins of the Roman theater, which we can still see in Amman. They will also have to live in caves to survive. So eventually, over the years, as some of the Roman ruins receded, the Circassian village was growing on top. Today, 3 of the 4 largest cities in Jordan are Amman, Zarqa, and Rusaifa, and these 3 of the 4 largest cities were founded by Circassian and Chechen refugees. Amman has over 4 million people today, and it recently became the largest city in the Levant, overtaking Damascus and Aleppo. In 1914, so the outbreak of World War I, it had the population of 5,000 people, and most of them were Circassian refugees. Circassian was the dominant language on the streets of Amman into the 1920s, even when Amman became the capital of Transjordan. So how did these non-Arab newcomers, these Circassian refugees from the Caucasus, play such an important role in building up this part of Jordan? And what was the Ottoman role in this story? By examining local land records, I found that in Jordan, refugees received generous allotments of free land in accordance with the Ottoman refugee regime. And the Ottoman government consistently backed the refugees' right to that land. In courts, and through local police force. Whenever local communities, Bedouin, merchants, and fellahin farmers challenged refugees for the right to own that land. Refugees then actively used the Ottoman Land Code of 1858 to register and buy as much additional land as they could. And they carefully recorded those transactions in new Ottoman land registries and in Sharia courts, Ottoman Islamic courts. And by doing that, they prompted others all around them, the Bedouin, the fellahin, the merchants, to do the same thing, to rush to the Ottoman land registries and register all the land that they owned or claimed that they owned. And once you register the land through this new system, you had to start paying tax on the land. So throughout the empire, refugees were entrenching the new Ottoman land code of 1858, and they were indirectly helping the Ottoman government to centralize its control over agricultural land and enforce taxation. Refugees also benefited from the Hijaz Railway. So the railway was built. It was the Ottoman prestige project. It connected Medina to Damascus, and then through the extension all the way to Istanbul. And it was the only railway that was built solely on Ottoman capital in late Ottoman history. It was a pilgrimage railway in many ways. It went through the village of Amman in 1903. And so this railway increased external interest in the region. Palestinian and Syrian merchants arrived in central Transjordan to buy wheat from refugees and also from the Bedouin. And refugees often served as intermediaries of those transactions. Circassians then started selling and renting out properties that they owned, houses and stores, to Palestinian and Syrian merchants. So this table shows the sales, the transactions of all the businesses sold in Amman in the late Ottoman period. All shops in the Circassian village were initially owned by Circassians, and they were sold to other Circassians or to the incoming Arab merchants. So we can see from this table that after the construction of the Hijaz Railway in 1903, the number of shops that were sold increases significantly. We can also see that Syrians and Palestinians from Damascus, Nablus, Jerusalem, they're arriving in this region and investing into real estate in Amman, because now this region became much more secure because of the railway and economically strategic. These Palestinian and Syrian merchant families would settle in Amman, and they would become the economic elite of Amman and eventually of Jordan to this day. Jivat Khutat, the younger brother, he also expanded his real estate business into stores. He bought 4 shops in downtown Amman for over 500 kurush each in the late 1890s. 15 years later, each store in that neighborhood sold for over 7,000 kurush. So from 500 to 7,000 kurush. The refugee village of Amman was becoming this boom town, this place where many people wanted to be in, on the Ottoman nomadic frontier. Over the 20th century, Amman, of course, became this quintessential refugee city. It expanded over successive rounds of displacement and arrivals by new refugees. The Armenian survivors of the genocide after 1915, the Palestinian survivors of the Nakba in 1948, Palestinian survivors in 1967, then Iraqi refugees, and now, of course, Syrian refugees. Everything about Amman's DNA, its demographics, its physical setup, its political economy, is that of a refugee city. But this story is the Ottoman and Circassian and refugee origin story of the largest city in the Levant. I would now like to say a few words about my sources for this book. So this book is based on research in Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, Russian, and Bulgarian in over 20 archives in 10 countries. And this history of migration operates on several levels. So on one level, it's a study of imperial migration policies. I was reconstructing piece by piece, how legislation and policies evolved. Ultimately, how migration policies propped up imperial governance, both Ottoman and Russian imperial governance. And for that story, I used many state records. I was using tax registers, population censuses, court records, police protocols, ministerial correspondence. I was also fortunate to get access to Ottoman land records for the entire Amman area. And this is a very rare type of source for late Ottoman history. And it's not really an archive. I somehow was granted a security clearance, don't know how, by the Jordanian Interior Ministry. And I was sitting in a governmental office next to three wonderful Jordanian officials who were receiving requests and petitions about the land. So I actually got to witness how some of the late Ottoman records still had a lot of judicial value. And I was allowed to look at the late Ottoman registers. I was not allowed to bring in a phone or a laptop. I had to copy everything by hand in pencil. But now I have this complete database of all property transactions involving refugees in the village, in the town of Amman, in its first 40 years. And that allowed me to make an argument and to show that Muslim refugees drove this new form of land speculation and capital accumulation. They were taking advantage of the Ottoman refugee regime, of the Ottoman land code of 1858, and also of the existing Levantine networks of capital. They were tapping into Palestinian, Syrian, Transjordanian merchant capital. But Empire of Refugees is also a bottom-up story of refugee resettlement. It was very important for me to show not only what the states were doing, but how refugees themselves were perceiving their displacement and resettlement. I was looking for refugee voices, and I managed to find quite a few. For many years, I've been collecting private letters that refugees wrote. So some letters were exchanged across the Russo-Ottoman border when refugees in the Ottoman Empire were writing to their families in the Caucasus. I wrote an article last year in Slavic Review called Letters from the Ottoman Empire. Those letters, they were usually smuggled into the Caucasus because correspondence was essentially prohibited by the Russian government, correspondence from Muslim refugees. And I'm telling the story in that article of how these letters provoked a pan-Islamic panic by the Russian bureaucrats in the Caucasus because they were so terrified of what those letters were saying because they couldn't read them often. So they were not sure what refugees are telling their families about the Ottoman Empire or about the Russian Empire. And then, of course, there are also many letters that were exchanged within families in the Ottoman Empire, like the Hutat story. So this family very generously granted me access to 58 letters in Ottoman Turkish, and it provides a completely new insight into how these families negotiated their resettlement, how they were negotiating with different authorities and with the Ottoman Refugee Commission, and what they had to do to survive. And then another rare source is petitions. So I looked at hundreds of petitions that are preserved in the archives that refugees sent to the Russian government before emigration or to the Ottoman government upon resettlement. Petitioning was an important part of the Ottoman refugee regime. It was very important for the refugees to know that they can speak to the government, that they can communicate their concerns to the government, and that the government would listen and hopefully respond. So refugees were petitioning about all kinds of concerns they had, things that mattered to them for their survival. And they were petitioning to different levels. They were petitioning the governors of districts, sub-provinces, and provinces in the Ottoman administrative system, also to the Ottoman Refugee Commission and to the Sultan himself. And they were couching their concerns in different ways, depending on whom they were speaking to. And I also conducted interviews with descendants of Caucasian and Chechen refugees in Turkey and Jordan. And their recollections, they complement my archival work on the resettlement of their ancestors. So to return to the political economy of refugee resettlement, my book shows that Muslim refugee resettlement fortified Ottoman rule in the outlying regions in Anatolia and in the Levant. It also accelerated the collapse of Ottoman rule in the Balkans. In the Balkans, the Ottomans didn't invest enough in resettling Muslim refugees in the 1860s, which led to the economic collapse of refugee villages, to banditry, and eventually it escalated to Muslim-Christian violence in 1876. So that sectarian violence contributed to the outbreak of the Russo-Ottoman War of 1877-78, and eventually expulsion of the Ottomans from half of their Balkan territories. So historians explain the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire in two main ways. It's either through geopolitics, because the Ottomans were losing wars, right? And they were losing territories and populations, or through cultural forces like nationalism and sectarianism that were absolutely destroying the fabric of Ottoman society and how Ottoman communities were relating to each other and to the government. So this book adds Muslim refugee resettlement to the mix. It shows that Muslim refugee resettlement had a profound impact on actually reinvigorating the empire in some regions. In regions like Jordan, but also many parts of central and eastern Anatolia. For the Ottomans, Muslim refugees were a way to prop up sovereignty, to consolidate state control over the land, and if all goes well, to grow the economy. So, what happened to the Hutats? Javad and his family stayed in Jordan. Javad dusted off his legal training, he improved his Arabic, and he became an attorney for Circassian refugees in Amman. Another family history that I'm telling in the book is that of the wealthiest person in central Transjordan in the late Ottoman period. And that richest person happened to be a Circassian refugee woman, Sayed Khan. So Javad Hutat was her lawyer. Meanwhile, Fuat moved back to Istanbul, a city that he loved. He became a superintendent in the Ottoman military academy. He also got married to an Armenian woman, Shafika, whom he met in Erzincan. They had 3 kids. In 1913, the Committee of Union and Progress carried out a coup, and after the installed Grand Vizier was assassinated, they unleashed a purge of the liberal opposition. Fuat was arrested and executed. According to family memories, all charges against him were false. His widow, Shafika, and their 3 children moved to Amman to be with the rest of the family during World War I. They then came back to Istanbul. All 3 children received good education, and they grew up to be part of the new generation of the new Turkey. Their daughter graduated from the American College for Girls, one of the best schools in Turkey. Their youngest son became a lawyer, like his Jordanian uncle, Javad. Their oldest son became a military officer, like his late father, Fuat. Since then, the family had been split. Javad's descendants live in Amman, and they speak Arabic. Fuat's descendants live in Istanbul, and they speak Turkish. After the fall of the Soviet Union, in the 1990s, several descendants of Javad from Amman went back to the Caucasus as tourists. It was the first time when Circassians could return to their homeland. And by using the notes and the letters of Fuat and the genealogical tree that he drew up in the late 19th century, they managed to find the Hutat family they were related to and a village where they were originally from. We have to say goodbye to the Hutats here. I want to conclude my talk by elaborating on a couple of contributions that this book makes and the broader implications of my research. So first, the Ottoman refugee regime offers us a new way to think about the history of global migration and resettlement. So here we have this system set up in response to European colonialism, but rooted in early Islamic history, on a distinct genealogy in Islamic history. The terminology of hijra and muhajir have a lot to offer in how we conceptualize refugee in Middle Eastern history, and also how we think about boundaries between refugee, immigrant, and emigrant, and also a settler. The vocabulary of hijra and muhajir is also salient today. throughout the 20th and early 21st centuries, this language is very meaningful to many displaced Muslim communities who use this vocabulary to make sense of horrible things that happen to them. So I'm currently working on a new book, which is a transnational history of Hijra in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I'm looking at how this terminology was used and what it meant to so many people who left the Caucasus, but also the Balkans, Central Asia, and South Asia. The Ottoman refugee regime also endured in many forms. When the empire ended, Ottoman legislation and infrastructure and know-how in resettling people, they were inherited by the new nation states in the Levant and the Turkish Republic. For example, the agricultural model of resettlement of refugees that was practiced in the 1920s and 1930s by the British in Iraq, the French in Syria and Lebanon, and then the Turkish Republic and the Greek Republic, they in many ways descended from the Ottoman refugee regime because they were settling refugees in the countryside. They wanted them to become farmers, which is a very different way of handling refugee resettlement than the Atlantic model, which is primarily urban. Second, displacement in the Ottoman and Russian empires ought to be studied together. Empires govern their populations, especially in the borderlands, through migration policies. And this story is intertwined with ethnic cleansing and sectarianism. The starkly different treatment of Christian and non-Christian subjects in the Tsarist Caucasus and Muslim and non-Muslim migrants in the Ottoman Empire were symptoms of a broader sectarian order. By the late 19th century, religious identity and perceptions of one's loyalty to the empire dangerously converged. And that paved way to ethnic cleansing and genocide in parts of the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Caucasus in the early 20th century. Therefore, to understand the history of these regions, connected regions, we should look at multiple things. We should look at Muslim displacement from the Caucasus and Crimea. We should look at the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocides. We should look at the Greek-Turkish population exchange and at Stalin's deportations from Crimea and the Caucasus in the 1940s in one frame, because that story was very much connected. And then finally, refugee migration is central to modern Middle Eastern history. The modern history of the region could be written as a history of displacement, including some of the world's largest and tragically ongoing refugee crises. What my book reveals is the Ottoman origins of organized refugee resettlement in the Middle East. The Ottoman government used Muslim refugees to solidify imperial rule in the outlying regions of the empire, especially nomadic and Christian areas, to centralize its control over agricultural land and to enforce taxation. Muslim refugee resettlement was critical to the very nature of the late Ottoman state. The Ottoman legitimacy and imperial hold on some regions became dependent on the continued admission of Muslim refugees. The Ottoman economy and demographics were reshaped through the immigration of Muslim refugees from Russia and then also from the Balkans. The late Ottoman Empire was an empire of refugees. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and the questions. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Vladimir. That was an exceptional tour de force, which took us through all sorts of different strands of late Ottoman history, and weaved fabulously together by the story of the Hutats and where they ended up. It was really, really wonderful. I enjoyed it so much. You brought in so many different strands: migration policies, a tool for re-centralizing power in imperial governments, settler colonialism, the early refugee regimes, entrepreneurialism. The Hutats were clearly entrepreneurs, and so were many of these North Caucasians, it seems. And then, of course, sort of darker elements such as Ottoman slavery, ethnic cleansing. But really, many congratulations on this book. It's a tremendous work of history, and I'm so looking forward to reading it. I have to say. So we're going to pass now to the Q&A part of this event. I'm going to start by asking a couple of questions and then opening up the floor to the discussion. So first thing, I wanted to sort of dial back and think about the identity of these refugees. So obviously the North Caucasus was a very agrarian region. It was not a typically urban as sort of some parts of Anatolia were. And did that have some role in determining how the refugees were settled? Because you talk a lot about being settled in agrarian areas, and I think that's an important aspect, and something also which I think is a bit of a contrast to aspects of the Greek-Turkish population exchange, where there were considerable communities settled in urban areas, particularly in places around the Aegean coast of Turkey and Istanbul. So I wonder, was this a ploy to help establish greater control by the Ottoman government in the way that we've discussed, to provide this sort of settler colonialism incentive, or was it simply a function of the origins of these people as non-urban and perhaps the affinity they would have in by living in other non-urban areas in Anatolia?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael. This is a great question. So, yes, the economy of the Caucasus, of the North Caucasus, it's mountains, right? It's high mountains. Sometimes it's the lowlands. So, some farming, but different kinds of farming that were practiced in many parts of the Ottoman Empire. Very pastoral economy, yes, usually. However, from the Ottoman perspective, that didn't. Let me actually sort of share the map again to illustrate this. For the Ottomans in the 1860s, right, at the height of the Circassian refugee crisis, the Ottomans have to resettle several 100,000 people within 2 years. At this point, the government is stretched, the funding is not there, the Refugee Commission was recently established, and it's not really many people, many officials working there, so they simply didn't have the resources and the time to think about who are these people, what kind of agriculture are they used to, where should we settle them? So in the 1860s, the resettlement was less strategic and more efficient. Let's make sure that these people not die in our Ottoman ports. And also, the Ottoman ports, they had a humanitarian crisis. Epidemic disease was breaking out. Many local people were affected. Consuls kept complaining about the epidemic disease. So the government tried to move refugees as quickly and as efficiently as possible to the interior and to resettle them somewhere, right? So that's why in the 1860s, much of the resettlement is actually very close to the coasts. It's northern Anatolia, it's western Anatolia, and it's also the Balkans, but pretty close to the Black Sea coast. After 1878, right, after the Berlin Treaty, the Ottoman government is much more strategic about where to settle people. It's thinking about the religious and ethnic identity of these people, but also the Ottoman Refugee Commission is much more experienced in resettling people. So like much more thought goes into this. And after 1878, in archival sources, I see the discussion of, okay, so we have Bulgarians coming in and they are from the mountainous areas, like they're used to pastoral economy, they have sheep. How about we settle them in a landscape that is similar, like to what they're used to? So much more thought goes into after that period, but not so much in the 1860s. However, the story of Uzunyaila is interesting here. The story of Uzunyaila, the government didn't directly settle people in Uzunyaila. It's more about North Caucasians discovering this valley and realizing that they thought it was empty. There's like a more complex story there. It was not exactly empty, but many Kabardians, so Eastern Circassians who live in the uplands in the Caucasus, many of them moved there, allegedly because the climate and the environmental conditions were similar, right, to their homeland. So refugees themselves, they of course were thinking about all this and where they could survive and what kind of agriculture they're used to. Many of the petitions that we're getting from refugees to the Ottoman government are precisely about this, that they're settled in areas that are not great for them, either in the swamp areas where malaria breaks out, or in the desert areas where they can't cultivate anything. And so they're trying to move somewhere, and they're explaining to the government that, like, we would like the area, that is irrigated, that has some water in it, that is not stony land. So, yeah, but the Ottomans were not really in a position to account for this in the 1860s at the height of the refugee crisis. Thank you.
Brilliant. That's a great answer. I mean, the reason I asked the questions is I'm sort of comparing and contrasting mentally with the Greek-Turkish population exchange, where you have an interesting counterpoint to what you've said.
I think they've learned
Yeah.
so much from all of this,
Yes.
for the Greek-Turkish population exchange. But
Yes.
interestingly enough, I don't think they reference, because referencing the Ottoman Empire at that point is kind of an anathema. Like we shouldn't reference them. But of course, that know-how, that's what they all had. And
yes.
So yeah.
No, but it's fascinating. Just if I may expand a tiny bit before I jump to my second and I hope last question, so I can bring in the floor. There were two parallel strains of migration as part of this Greek-Turkish population exchange. You have a successful migration and an unsuccessful migration. The successful migration is the case of the Cretan Muslims who arrived in Izmir and they had lived in cities mainly. They had lived in places like Hania and Heraklion. They were very liberal. They were very urban. Of course, they lived in cities. They were very entrepreneurial. They had businesses. They had shops. They had capital. They had money to spend, and they became part of the urban entrepreneurial elite of the Aegean region, particularly in Izmir. By contrast, in Salonika, you have the arrival of rural Pontian immigrants from the Black Sea region, who did not integrate very quickly into this great commercial port city of Salonika. And Salonika lost a lot of its kind of entrepreneurial capital by virtue of the fact that the people coming in were not used to operating in environments such as that. So I find it very interesting that there was an attempt on the part of the Ottoman authorities after a certain point to ensure that there is an affinity in the point of origin, the point of arrival for these immigrants, these refugees, I should say. So that's absolutely fascinating. I'm going to ask the second question, then I'm going to open up to the floor. So I'm very interested in this land code of 1858 that you referenced. Which favoured land distribution, as I understand it, to refugees. And I wanted to ask what conflicts may have arisen as a result of that amongst the new population, between the new populations and the existing populations of Anatolia in particular. You talked about the Levant, but I'm curious about Anatolia. So if you have anything to say on that, I'd be very grateful.
Of course. So conflicts broke out almost immediately. Right. And again, so many petitions were from refugees. Many petitions to the Ottoman government were from the neighboring communities complaining about refugees. Right. And that's what the book does. It really complicates the story. These refugees, they were survivors of something horrendous. Many of them were survivors of ethnic cleansing, of genocide by the Russian government in Circassia. But from the perspective of many locals, not just Christians, like Muslim locals and Druze locals, and sometimes even the earlier generations of refugees from Crimea and the Caucasus, they were settlers. They were put there in different regions by the Ottoman government, and they were taking the land that the Ottoman government thought was its to give, but local communities usually disagreed. Even if they were not tilling that land and they were not paying tax on that land, they would claim in petitions, but our ancestors did, so it's still our land, and you have no right to reassign it to refugees. So we see conflicts over land literally through pretty much every region. So in the Balkans, Bulgarians and Greeks and Crimean Tatars were complaining about them. In the Levant, it was often the Bedouin and the Falahin communities in Syria and in Jordan, and also the Druze in Syria's Golan Heights. And in Anatolia, there were many conflicts with Armenian, Greek, Turkish-speaking populations, and especially the nomadic populations. So that's
fascinating.
That's fascinating. And the Ottoman government, I mentioned, it often backed up the refugees' right to the land, as it did in in Jordan, it did so in Uzun Yayla. So the story of Uzun Yayla again is interesting here because that was the first time when the Ottomans actually introduced troops in the region. The Afshars, which is a Turkic-speaking nomadic population, that was their land, the region of Uzun Yayla. It was their summer pasture. They would spend winters down south in Shukurova, and in the summer they would go up for a better climate. And so one summer they come back and they find up to 40,000 North Caucasian refugees in their valley. So of course there's a conflict between the two communities, and the Ottomans introduced the troops from all around to protect the refugees and their right to the land. And I think they were doing this because Uzun Yayla had this iconic status at that point, a land where many Circassian refugees want to be. And the refugees were watching how the Ottoman government would respond if it would actually back their right to the land. And for the Ottomans, it was also a prestige thing. Like, we have the land code, we need to defend our land code. And they wanted to harass the Afshars for a bit. So they introduced the troops, they essentially expelled the Afshars, and the mountain valley became a Circassian mountain valley. And of course, it bred a lot of resentment and tensions between these two communities, like for decades to come.
That's absolutely fascinating, and I do wonder how that tension would have played out as the sort of state ideology moved from Ottomanism to Turkism, and these people were no longer just other Muslims; they were now identifiable as a different ethnic group as well, potentially. So we could perhaps discuss that later on. But I'm now going to open up the discussion to the floor. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand, and I will try and bring you in. And if people are shy, then I can keep going, I guess. But I would like to bring you in. So Zehra, you have your hand up.
Hi, thanks so much for that. It's really fascinating talk. Like, all of my favorite kinds of history: oral, micro, family, all in one place, and all about Turkey and Russia, my two favorite places. One of the things I wanted to pick up on though was your use of family history. Like, first of all, I'm intrigued about how you got in touch with this family and how you got them to share their archives with you and things. But secondly, kind of from a more kind of scholarly perspective, there's lots more historians, like scholarly historians, using family history and trying to work at the intersection of these things. And I wonder if you could just elaborate a little bit on the kind of like the positives and the pitfalls of doing so.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. So I got in touch with the family. When I arrived, I did not expect to do oral histories, to be honest. When I arrived in Amman, that was the very first country out of 10 where I was doing field work. I met some Circassians very soon, and they invited me to dinner, one family, and then it kind of snowballed, and I kept going to dinners pretty much every other night. The community was so incredibly generous, and it was actually the very last. Okay, and throughout those months in Amman, I kept asking people, like, have you heard of any private letters or any documents that were written by refugees themselves back in the 19th century? And the answer was usually, well, no. Like, it happened such a long time ago. Like, that kind of evidence probably would not have survived. And on my very last day in Jordan, I haven't been back to Jordan since then, I received a call from my interlocutor saying there's someone who would like to meet you. And so we went to the Circassian Charitable Association for tea, as we usually did, and I've met this representative of the Hutat family who had a folder with them with 58 letters. And he said, well, I heard that you were looking for letters. Like, is this something that you're looking for? So, and that's the beginning of this family history, that they generously allowed me to write. And over the years, I've been communicating with them, and I've been interviewing, to find out more and to fill in some of the gaps in those private letters. So there are, of course, so many different ways to use those kinds of materials. Those private letters that they were not meant for the consumption of the state. So the state authorities were not supposed to see them. So it's a very intimate perspective on resettlement. The refugees and their friends, they're discussing how to benefit from resettlement, essentially, how to survive, but also, real estate, like where to buy land and how to benefit from that land. They talk about buying guns to protect their land. It's all kinds of issues that really don't show up in the state archive, which has been fascinating. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, it's a rare source for the study of late Ottoman migration. there are relatively few family letters that seem to be available. And also, right, as many people would know, it requires field work, it requires trust, establishing relations with those families who would grant you the right to tell that, access to the documents and allow you to tell that story. So it is difficult working with this. And I think not enough historians are also getting the kind of training, because this kind of research is so associated with anthropology, right, and more kind of like fieldwork based fields. I kept looking for other families, right, and for other stories like this through the fieldwork. And as I mentioned, it is quite difficult because there are incredible oral histories that are available, but so few letters. And I also want to mention that some North Caucasian activists in Syria, in Jordan, in Turkey right now, they're very much engaging with their communities, collecting oral histories while they're still available. So one book is by Elbrus Aksoy in Istanbul in Turkey, who's been traveling to various Circassian villages and collecting material about the Armenian genocide and World War I and what happened then and what was the role of the Circassian community, and also Circassian enslavement, right, and bondage, some of the very taboo topics in the community. So there are some fascinating developments in the community, and many topics that used to be taboo, now people, write and discuss this. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent. Let me see if there's anyone else. Quentin.
Yeah, thank you. I think you partially answered a question that I was thinking about, was the modern day identity of Circassians, particularly in Amman, but it could be anywhere else. Do they identify as a community? Amman's one example, but maybe elsewhere in the former empire, perhaps you could comment on that. The second part of the question is, particularly relating to Amman, what does the modern day Jordanian government recognize as the identity and contribution of the Muhajir?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Quentin. I really appreciate it. Okay, so yes, let's talk about the diasporic identity, because the origins are in the late Ottoman period. So these refugees, right, about under 1 million of them, they were displaced throughout the empire. And the first couple of generations, it's really survival. Like they're scattered all over. They're often disconnected with from their elites, who either stayed in the Caucasus or who moved into Ottoman cities and did not become Muhajir. They didn't get their legal identity. They didn't want the free land. They wanted to be in the cities. But then the critical moment is 1908. So 1908 is the Young Turk Revolution that changes everything for most communities in the late Ottoman Empire. 200 newspapers appear in Istanbul within a couple of years, and people can organize based on ethno-religious principle, which they couldn't really, right, in the past, on the political level. So the North Caucasian diaspora establishes the association in Istanbul. So it's the first time that there's a diasporic association that seeks to unite all the North Caucasian Muhajirs in the empire. And for them, one of the key issues is what you mentioned. What is the identity? Like, we're all so different, right? We speak different languages, different ethnic groups. And so the decision is made eventually. They start publishing a newspaper in Ottoman Turkish, and then they start adding Circassian. And it's the first time Circassian is being written as a language, published in a newspaper as a language. And so there's the consensus that let's describe ourselves as Cherkess, right? Sharkas, as a Circassian, because the government already understands us all as a Circassian, right? So and the most of the community are ethnically Circassian. So let's promote this identity while internally we'll know, the diversity. Then things change during World War I, because at that point, World War I, the war between the Russians and the Ottomans again, they're on different sides, and the North Caucasus is potentially back in play. So this association kind of becomes an arm of the foreign policy of the Ottoman government. And there's a rebranding. Instead of the emphasis on Circassian, the emphasis is on North Caucasian, on this multi-ethnic identity, like we are from one region, from the mountains. That is the basis. And so this really becomes the origin of North Caucasian politics in the Middle East today. It's this emphasis on, we know who we are ethnically, Circassian, Ossetian, Abkhazian, and we promote the cultural development within our communities. But then externally, most communities would position themselves as like North Caucasian, and kind of solidarity between the different communities, like we're stronger together. But then, of course, there's the element that comes from the late Ottoman period. We're also loyal. We're loyal to the host government that gave us refuge, and we're in solidarity with our neighboring communities. So today it translates like we are proud Turkish citizens, Syrian citizens, Iraqi, Jordanian, Israeli citizens, right? Things like that. And generally speaking, even though much of the diaspora would not speak the ancestral languages, the sense of community and the sense of identity is very strong for many people, right? And there's a sense of pride in being Circassian, Chechen. And especially since the 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when many people could go back to the Caucasus as tourists, and also many even try to immigrate there, there's greater awareness about the homeland, about the cultures of the homeland. There's much more literature that is being translated about the Caucasus into Turkish and into Arabic. So things like that. So a strong sense of identity. Now, the relationship between the Jordanian government and the Muhajirs. When the Ottoman Empire collapses, all these refugee communities scattered throughout the Middle East and parts of the Balkans, they have to forge new relations with new powers. And they do that with the Turkish national movement, with the Greek occupying authorities in Western Anatolia, with the British and French mandate authorities, eventually with Jordanian, Syrian, Israeli authorities. And often the thing that they have to offer and what those new governments need kind of coincide. It's the military experience that some of these communities have. Because by the time of World War I, there's so many people from the North Caucasian diaspora who are in the army, like the Hutas, and who actually achieved quite big things. And so during World War I, they often lead Circassian or Dagestani or Chechen kind of small militias, and they offer their services to their new states. So that's why in the 20th century, and that's one of the stereotypes in the Middle East, the Circassian diaspora is often associated with the military and with the security apparatus. That's the Ottoman and post-Ottoman origins of that stereotype. Because again, much of the diaspora is actually quite rural and is much more involved in agriculture than in the military or anything urban. So in Jordan, like I think that's the quintessential story here. The Jordanian government very much relied on Circassians, especially in the 1920s, to the point that 30% of the Transjordanian military by the mid-1920s were actually Circassians, right? And that close association between Circassians, whose town became the capital of Jordan, and the Hashemite dynasty, like it became strong ever since. And the Royal Guard, famously, Circassian Royal Guard, is made up of Circassians, which is kind of an homage to the 1920s and the support that the Circassians provided to the Hashemites in the critical period.
Well, that's fascinating. Thank you very much. I never knew that.
Thank you.
Excellent. So we have a couple of questions from Sultana Al-Kuwaiti in the chat. So I will read out the first one. So the first relates to Cyprus. Is there still a vibrant Caucasian presence in Cyprus? Vladimir.
Right, thank you, Sultana. I'm afraid not, to the best of my knowledge. There were several villages there that were established in the 1860s, but my understanding, and there's very, very little academic literature on settlements in Cyprus. I think the assimilation was incredibly strong, so people people got assimilated quickly, or many people continued their journeys on, probably to the Levant, right? I also know that Cyprus was a transit point. So many boats from Istanbul after 1878. So the Circassian refugees from the Balkans, they would sail through Cyprus, again, onto Palestine. And from there, they would move to Jordan or to Syria. So I'm afraid no, there's no strong community there.
A related question, perhaps leading on also from your answer, is has there been any serious research on Caucasian communities in the Hejaz, Medina, Taif, Jeddah, etc.?
Again, thank you. That's great. Very little scholarly literature on this, and there are also very few North Caucasians who would be living there. Their stories are slightly different than the refugees that I was talking about today. There are some. So many Chechens and Dagestanis in the 1850s, right? Like the final stages of the Caucasus War, the defeat of the Caucasus Imamate in 1859, some of them became muhajirs, and some of them moved. Many of them hoped to move to the area around Mecca and Medina. But in general, the Ottoman government very much did not want this. So this area was out of bounds. Refugees could not actually move there. They would not be given free land there. But I do see, so in Jordan, there are the southernmost refugee villages, there are Chechen villages, and I interviewed some people there. There are oral histories that some founders of those early Chechen villages, they did the pilgrimage first to the Hijaz, right, to Mecca, to Medina, and then they decided to stay in the Ottoman Empire, and they tried to settle as close as possible to the Hijaz, where the Ottoman government would allow them. And so it was Jordan. And I think the North Caucasian descendants who are in that region right now, in Hijaz, in Taif, in Jeddah, they probably moved there before the 1860s, 1850s, and it was the story of the pilgrimage. There's a fantastic book by Lali Jan, Spiritual Subjects, about Central Asian pilgrims. So some of them were pilgrims, but then they stayed in the Hijaz or in Damascus or in Istanbul, and they became mujawir, which is a different legal term, like that the Ottomans used for those people who were not exactly subjects of the Ottoman Empire, but who were kind of religious subjects, and they were allowed to live in the holy cities. So I suspect that some North Caucasians were very much participating in those journeys as well, and got to stay there. But there's not enough scholarly literature, at least not that I know of. Thank you so much for your question.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that question, Sultana. Now, we have a little bit of time left, about 5 minutes left for anyone else who'd like to ask a question. Would anyone like to come in?
Oh, thank you. And you mentioned, right, there are many families here with Caucasian family names, Dagestani, Shishani. That's fascinating. I think also the story that I know that many... So there's the pilgrimage, but also many highly educated families from the Caucasus who were educated in the best madrasas of the Russian Empire. Sometimes they were seeking employment in the Ottoman Empire. And many of them, again, moved to that region, to the Hijaz, and were teaching there. So perhaps some of the families could be descendants of the sheikhs and of the ulama. And I know this is the story for many Central Asians as well in the region. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any hands up in the online audience. I'll give you 5 seconds or 10 seconds to put your hands up. Otherwise, I'm going to come in with a last question of my own. Okay. All right. So let's think bigger picture now, and connect this to sort of wider historical narratives of refugee resettlement and migration, or forced migration, as of course characterized the 20th century. What would you mentioned that this is a sort of starting point in many ways for the events of the post First World War period in particular. So I wonder how you would sort of map out this relationship between the Ottoman refugee regimes and later regimes, which of course were possibly more punishing and more violent and more systematic, perhaps. How would you chart that? How would you connect this to a wider historical narrative of refugee resettlement?
This is an incredible question. Thank you. Also a difficult one. So yeah, let me talk about two things. First, the impact of the Ottoman refugee regime, right, that I already mentioned, like what that all meant for others in the post-Ottoman period. And second, what that means for the study of Circassianism and for the violence, right, after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. So the impact of the Ottoman refugee regime, I already mentioned the agricultural model of resettlement, which was really unique to the region and very much stems from what the Ottomans were doing. Then the immigration law of 1857 and the land code of 1858, they survived in national legislations, right? In the post-1878 Balkans and in the post-1923 Anatolia and the Levant. So right now I'm working on an article about legislation in the Balkans, comparing Romania, Bulgaria, and Serbia, and what they were doing with the land of the refugees who had left, and what they were doing with the immigration legislation. And of course, 1878 is this massive rupture in Balkan historiography, but actually, as one might expect, like they were borrowing so much from the Ottoman legislation. It's just the replacement of the categories. Instead of Muslim refugees, who were the favorable population to be settled, it's now co-ethnic, co-religious refugees for Bulgaria, for Serbia, for Romania. So Romanians, Bulgarians, and Serbians, and Serbs and Montenegrins returning or colonizing those areas from elsewhere. But the legislation is incredibly similar. Often the language is directly translated into Romanian, Serbian. So it's fascinating. And also, so the element of the Ottoman refugee regime that might seem very different for us, not what we expect today from international refugee regime, is this religious component, right? Religion is the main category. Like one system for Muslim refugees, non-Muslim migrants are treated differently. But this preferential religious treatment actually exists in the interwar period as well, when the League of Nations is established. The League of Nations is much more favorable towards Christian refugees, right? So it's primarily preoccupied with the Russian and Armenian refugees. Like that's the origins of that first international refugee regime. It pays much less attention to Muslim and Jewish refugees in the same time period. So there was preferential treatment as well, based on whom members of the League of Nations, mostly European countries, wanted and cared about. Okay. Now, when it comes to sectarianism, so in the field of modern Middle Eastern history, there is very rich scholarship about sectarianism. It's one of the kind of main questions: when did sectarianism emerge in the modern Middle East? And a lot of scholarship pointed at massacres in Aleppo in 1850 and then massacres in Damascus and Mount Lebanon in 1860, right? There's an incredible rich scholarship there because those events were indeed sectarian violence. They were something new for the history of the Levant because there was so much coexistence before and during and after. So those events stand out as aberration. So, I mean, I specialize in the Russo-Ottoman borderlands. When we look at what was happening northern Anatolia, eastern Anatolia, the Balkans, the Caucasus, it's a very different story of sectarianism that is emerging. Sectarian violence between Muslim and Christian communities that is interpreted in sectarian ways, like it begins earlier. And the Russo-Ottoman wars, that start much earlier. By the late 18th century, the Russo-Ottoman wars start playing a big role of that. There's this growing correlation between your religious identity, and if you're Muslim, you're probably loyal to the Ottoman Empire, and you should probably be there and be safer there. If you're Christian, you're probably more loyal to Russia or Greece, and you should be there. And so that convergence, as I mentioned, is incredibly dangerous. And we see it evolving already from the late 18th century. It grows stronger and stronger. And then people are learning more vocabularies to describe themselves, to tie themselves closer to the idea of a nation state. And we see this collapse and horrific violence. in the Balkans, Anatolia, and the Caucasus. But this story, it's in many ways key to this because of how the Ottomans were using Muslim refugees and how the Russians and the Greeks and the Bulgarians and the Romanians, how they were witnessing this and the lessons that they were all learning from it. So in some ways, it provided a very dangerous blueprint to many governments in the area about what a modern state can do, like how it can either displace 90% of the population and then how it can resettle 500,000 of population within 2 years, right? And so it's a very scary and it's a very grim lesson that many have learned and then applied with horrific consequences in the 20th century. And I'm going to stop here.
Well, it's a very poignant note to end on, Vladimir. It's been a real pleasure to have you. It was a fantastic lecture, full of fascinating information, and as I say, so many strands that interlock. And particularly enjoyed this focus on the Hukat, which I think was something which is not done enough, certainly in this kind of history. So you connect the small to the big, and that's so rare. So been a real pleasure to have you. And of course, there are other Anglo-Turkish Society events upcoming, and you'll be welcome to all of those, and all of you indeed will be welcome to return to those events. As members of the Anglo-Turkish Society, you'll be receiving information about these events. I do see a message from Sultana asking, how do I join the society? Please send a link. I think Craig will probably do that and get you signed up as a member of the society. So do stay tuned for upcoming Anglo-Turkish Society events, and please join me in thanking Vladimir for what has been a fascinating evening, taking us from the North Caucasus into Anatolia, into the Levant, into the Balkans, and touching so many wonderful aspects of history. So thank you very much, Vladimir.
Many thanks to the society, many thanks to Michael, and thank you very much for the fantastic discussion. I hope everyone has a wonderful night.
Brilliant. Have a great day. See you later.
Yeah.